right, here we go. Okay, I'm just gonna set this up. All right, so these are the second. You guys pull those up from. Okay, great. So these are the second notes for the chapter, essentially section 2. And like I said, kind of rest of the chapter here is basically kind of like history that you guys probably had like in middle school or even probably grade school, right? Like our U.S. history classes, those of you guys if you're going to take U.S. history next year or whatever, usually start. We usually start like kind of after the Civil War. All right, so some of the stuff is kind of familiar with you. So I'm doing it's almost like kind of historical cliff notes at this point here. All right, so on what was it Tuesday, we had talked about. Then we introduced the chapters talking about the various types of governments, right? And so we had talked about kind of like the types of governments where we have, the oldest form of government probably being monarchies, right? The idea that power is vested from some kind of divine kind of intervention from a deity, if you will. Monarchs tend not to be elected, right? They're basically kind of like that's based on your kind of heritage, your family. There are still some countries that have monarchies. Like there's a few that are absolute monarchies, but the majority of them that have like kings and queens or emperors, like in Japan, they are mainly figureheads. We call them constitutional monarchies because the power is vested in some like lawmaking body. And we talk about totalitarian style governments, both the right, which is very kind of like nationalistic, kind of in the sense like fascism, and then on the left like communism and that, right? And then our style of government, which is a democracy. Remember, we talked about two styles of democracy. There's a direct democracy, with its origins in ancient Greece. That's mainly for smaller kind of like area communities or whatever, right? Or like we took a vote and I said, let's like either take notes or sleep, and we vote to sleep, and then we're all going to bed, right? Most democracies in the world are representative, or we would call republics, and that's what the United States is. All right, now we in our kind of historical heritage, all right, we are kind of coming out of a country that has a monarchy, but also has a like kind of the beginnings of kind of constitutional kind of pattern here of government. All right, so to understand how we get to becoming a republic, right, we have to kind of trace our steps back. Probably, and again, we were talking about in chapter 1, we are a colony of Great Britain, right? That's pretty obvious, right? That was basically kind of something that you probably learned in grade school, right? Now, when we were talking about in chapter 1, we were talking about how Europeans were colonizing the North American continent, right? Two countries came in conflict that were in conflict with one another throughout much of the 18th into probably 19th century, and that's Great Britain and United Kingdom and France, right? The French had laid claims to areas like around here, like Cahokia. So basically was established as a French colony. St. Louis, which is named after Louis IX, who was the King of France, right? The British were mainly along the eastern seaboard. However, within the Ohio Valley, there was some dispute on kind of territorial, like where one country's territorial claims started and the other ones ended. All right, this comes to what we call a crescendo, with something that's a larger world conflict called the 7 Years' War. All right, where England and France and kind of various allies are kind of fighting each other on the continent of Europe. In India, they call them the Carnatic Wars, and then on the North American continent, they call it the 7 Years' War. All right, so we're talking in the 1750s into about 1763. All right, it was called the 7 Years' War, although it took for the final treaty to kind of end the war about 9 years. All right, but either way, this name French and Indian War comes from a kind of British perspective. All right, it was the British and the American kind of British colonists were fighting the French and their Indian allies, and the British had Indian allies as well. All right, so native allies essentially kind of like for example the Illini. All right, where Illinois gets its name, aligned themselves with the French. After this war, the Illini were kind of forced to kind of leave. There was a treaty just down the street, the Treaty of Edwardsville, that kind of forced the Illini almost out of Illinois entirely. All right, so this war is, and like wars, tend to cost a lot of money. All right, so the British were basically kind of after this war felt like they needed to recoup, right, and so they needed to kind of like generate some revenue. And so as a result, they started taxing the colonists more. All right. So this here, like I said, this is the kind of like the disputed area right here. All right. Kaskaskia. All right. It was Cahokia. We're both like kind of French settlements there. There's a place called Fort Deschartres. Deschartres, it's down like kind of like Randolph County. every year they do a reenactment called a rendezvous, and in that, at the end of that rendezvous, they do a kind of ceremony where they change the French flag, which is the fleur de lis, to the British flag. All right. So as a result here, essentially, kind of the French controlled mainly like kind of Quebec in that area, and then down into kind of Louisiana. St. Louis was still part of a French colony, if you will. All right. But like I said, as a result, right, and these are some of the kind of battles here of the French and Indian War. Like for example, like in Fort de Chartres, there was a small garrison that actually kind of went and was, I think it was at Fort Necessity, was responsible for taking on the British. So this is essentially the kind of like where we have now at this point in 1763 after the Treaty of Paris. All right. So certain areas, like I said, St. Louis is still a French colony. All right. So what ends up happening, like I said, the British are kind of, in a sense, trying to recoup some of the money that they spent on this. All right. And so there's a number of acts that were passed back in London that American colonists felt infringed upon their rights. All right. The first major one being the Stamp Act. All right. And this was essentially dealing with printed materials, everything from like contracts to decks of cards and things of that nature. All right. What it basically was is that you would get a stamp, a seal, all right, a royal seal there that said that this is an official kind of British product that could be sold in the American colonies. All right. A lot of American colonists took kind of umbrage, if you will, with this. All right. They didn't understand, why they would have to pay for this. All right. That this was just basically kind of adding something that was not necessarily, not necessary. All right. So this is, we start to see people saying, the kind of American colonists complaining that they didn't have a say in this. All right. And we start to hear this whole concept of taxation without, have you ever heard this, representation? Good. All right. So the kind of the Stamp Act, which gets rescinded and then kind of tweaked a little bit, is the first real kind of challenge the American colonists have to the British government, because they feel like they don't have a say in the matter, that these are decisions that are made for them without their kind of consent and their addition. All right. So we see like a number of kind of colonists start to kind of push back against the British. All right. I'm going to play this video here. I got a couple TED Ed videos. All right. Probably one of the more kind of famous kind of oppositions or kind of vocal protests was the Boston Tea Party. All right. And I'm going to play this and see. Let's play this one. This one's only like 4 minutes.
You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party. Something about a bunch of angry colonists dressed as Native Americans throwing chests of tea into the water. But the story is far more complicated, full of imperial intrigue, corporate crisis, smuggling, and the grassroots origins of the American Revolution. The first thing you need to know about tea in the 1700s is that it was really, really popular. In England, each man, woman, and child consumed almost 300 cups of the stuff every year. And since the English colonized America, Americans were crazy about tea too. By the 1760s, they were drinking over 1 million pounds of tea every year. So when Britain wanted to increase taxes on tea in America, people were not happy, mostly because they had no say in tax decisions made in London. Remember that famous phrase, no taxation without representation? The American colonists had long believed that they were not subject to taxes imposed by legislature in which they lacked representation. In fact, rather than paying the taxes, they simply dodged the tax collectors. Since the east coast of America is hundreds of miles long and British enforcement was lax, about 3/4 of the tea Americans were drinking was smuggled in, usually from Holland. But the British insisted that Parliament did have the authority to tax the colonists, especially after Britain went deeply into debt fighting the French in the 7 Years' War. To close the budget gap, London looked to Americans and in 1767 imposed new taxes on a variety of imports, including the Americans' beloved tea. America's response? No thanks. They boycotted the importation of tea from Britain and instead brewed their own. After a new bunch of British customs commissioners cried to London for troops to help with tax enforcement, things got so heated that the Redcoats fired on a mob in Boston, killing several people in what was soon called the Boston Massacre. Under the terms of the 1773 Tea Act, Parliament cooked up a new strategy. Now the East India Company would sell the surplus tea directly through hand-picked consignees in America. This would lower the price to consumers, making British tea competitive with the smuggled variety while retaining some of the taxes. But the colonists saw through the British ploy and cried, "Monopoly!" Now it's a cold and rainy December 16th, 1773. About 5,000 Bostonians are crowded into the Old South Meeting House, waiting to hear whether new shipments of tea that arrived down the harbor will be unloaded for sale. When the captain of one of the ships reported that he could not leave with his cargo on board, Sam Adams rose to shout, "This meeting can do no more to save the country." Cries of "Boston Harbor at Teapot tonight" rang out from the crowd, and about 50 men, some apparently dressed as Native Americans, marched down to Griffin's Wharf, stormed aboard 3 ships, and threw 340 tea chests overboard. An infuriated British government responded with the so-called Coercive Acts of 1774, which, among other things, closed the port of Boston until the locals compensated the East India Company for the tea. That never happened. Representatives of the colonies gathered in Philadelphia to consider how best to respond to continued British repression. This First Continental Congress supported destruction of the tea, pledged to support a continued boycott, and went home in late October 1774, even more united in their determination to protect their rights and liberties. The Boston Tea Party began a chain reaction that led with little pause to the Declaration of Independence and a bloody rebellion, after which the new nation was free to drink its tea, more or less, in peace.
Yeah, so I got another TED thing. They're nice little kind of like synopsis or whatever. So like the video had said here, there's kind of crescendo on this whole idea of kind of this idea of American colonists being taxed to without their consent, and that the crescendo of this kind of this idea is with the Boston Tea Party, right? And so like the video said, the British, the deal was they were taxing on this tea. So American colonists decided to try to find a cheaper way. So they're smuggling tea in, right? And so, and the British put a big investment. They had a company called the British East India Company, right? That wasn't just with tea, but other things like cotton and stuff like that. That was kind of a quasi kind of extension of the government there, right? And kind of this concept of mercantilism. And so the colonists, when they were kind of hit with this kind of this blockade, they again kind of took matters in their own hands and famously kind of dumped the tea into the harbor. Right. The whole idea is the guys they're talking about the guy Sam Adams. You ever heard the beer Sam Adams? That's the guy that it's named after. Sam Adams was a prominent kind of printer guy who would send out kind of what we call propaganda, if you will. And kind of called for this kind of basically boycott on tea. A group called the Sons of Liberty, who kind of were advocating for this kind of like kind of boycott. That's where you hear the concept of no taxation without representation. All right, and eventually this leads to these coercion acts and such, and so things are getting a little bit more tense, right, in the colonies, right. And so this is a famous photo here. Like the video had said, they'd show, some of these guys are dressed as Native Americans. The purpose of that, I'm not totally sure, right? But this also led to, we start to see the number of people kind of like, stop drinking tea, or at least limit the tea eventually. And this is where coffee becomes a more kind of popular kind of drink, right? And so we don't have, like in England, you still have potentially tea time, right? We don't have that. That whole idea of tea time came to represent kind of the British government. So we start to see people kind of moving away from the tradition of drinking tea, right? And then eventually, like when we see things that, like prior to the Boston Tea Party, you had the Boston Massacre, right? One of the first people to be martyred in the Boston Massacre was the African American guy named Crispus Attucks, right? And tensions finally come to kind of a head here in a kind of a military capacity. With the first kind of shots of the American Revolution in 2 places in Massachusetts, Lexington and Concord. Right, and so 1775 is we consider that the beginning, if you will, of the kind of start of the American Revolution. However, we haven't, as colonists, decided that what we're doing here is to create a separate country. Right, this is mainly still a issue about taxes. All right, and our kind of defiance towards kind of these taxes being forced upon American colonists, if you will. All right, and this is kind of image here of the first one, sir. And so eventually, like I said, the First Continental Congress was kind of reaction to kind of the Boston Tea Party. Right, the Second Continental Congress we meeting in Philadelphia. This is where kind of what they say the rubber meets the road, so to speak. All right, this was where it was the decision to draw up basically a Declaration of Independence. All right, now this is not. We kind of take this lightly, it's time has passed. So, but what a lot of these guys were doing is essentially to the British, this was treasonous. If this doesn't succeed, if they don't, if the American colonists don't win the Civil War, the American Revolution, these guys are minor footnotes in history. All right, they will we would be studying British history, and these guys would be kind of considered this would be they're like maybe traitors to a certain extent. All right, so what these guys were doing was taking a big risk here. All right, let's see. So what ends up happening at the Second Continental Congress is the issuing the kind of signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so it was approved, although I'm going to show you a video that July 4th wasn't initially supposed to be the date, but July 4th is the kind of the date that commemorates the Declaration of Independence. That's why people celebrate the 4th of July. A friend of mine had a sister when he was in high school. She put on their calendar 4th of July, and then the rest of the calendar, he put 5th of July, 6th of July, 7th of July. So he thought it was funny, but it's not. So this is why we shoot off fireworks, right? This is, or did. I don't know if anybody was doing that this summer, or with COVID, if you will. All right, so you guys had this covered in probably grade school, right? I'm going to show you another short. This is a shorter TED video. This is a famous painting of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. All right, the guy here, right here, he's the guy who's credited with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Remember who he is? Thomas Jefferson. Good. All right. Although there were other people that were involved with this. All right. I'm going to show this TED Ed video here that kind of talks about that. Go.
They said the act of wearing the Indian dress was to express that they're American colonists and no longer consider themselves British.
Yeah, and a simple Google search would have helped me with that one. I haven't taught this in a while. Yeah, they're cultural, what we call cultural appropriating to a certain extent. Yeah. Oh, here we go back. Sorry about that.
See how you can enjoy high-quality sleep and a cleaner ocean with the new Beauty Rest Harmony Luxe.
Well, that looks like an accident.
All men are created equal, and they are endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not so fast, Mr. Jefferson. These words from the Declaration of Independence and the facts behind them are well known. In June of 1776, a little more than a year after the war against England began with the shots fired in Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia to discuss American independence. After long debates, a resolution of independence was approved on July 2nd, 1776. America was free, and men like John Adams thought we would celebrate that date forever. But it was 2 days later that the gentlemen in Congress voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, offering all the reasons why the country should be free. More than 235 years later, we celebrate that day as America's birthday. But there are some pieces of the story you may not know. First of all, Thomas Jefferson gets the credit for writing the Declaration, but 5 men had been given the job to come up with a document explaining why America should be independent. Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were all named first. And it was Adams who suggested that the young and little-known Thomas Jefferson join them, because they needed a man from the influential Virginia delegation, and Adams thought Jefferson was a much better writer than he was. Second, though Jefferson never used footnotes or credited his sources, some of his memorable words and phrases were borrowed from other writers and slightly tweaked. Then Franklin Adams offered a few suggestions, but the most important change came after the Declaration was turned over to the full Congress. For 2 days, a very unhappy Thomas Jefferson sat and fumed while his words were picked over. In the end, The Congress made a few minor word changes and one big deletion. In the long list of charges that Jefferson made against the King of England, the author of the Declaration had included the idea that George III was responsible for the slave trade and was preventing America from ending slavery. That was not only untrue, but Congress wanted no mention of slavery in the nation's founding document. The reference was cut out before the Declaration was approved and sent to the printer. But it leaves open the hard question: how could the men who were about to sign a document celebrating liberty and equality accept a system in which some people owned others? It is a question that would eventually bring the nation to civil war, and one we can still ask today.
So just kind of a little interesting facts there, they're kind of related to that. So here is a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And then probably the most famous signature, one of the most famous signatures, is John Hancock's there. And the legend, and some of this stuff is legend, right? The legend is that he wrote it big enough so the king could see it, right? So when anybody says, I don't know if anybody uses these terms sometimes, they put your John Hancock, that doesn't mean just like signing it, all right? Now, but keep in mind, these guys, like I said, this is a major calculated move here. What these guys are essentially doing to the British are basically, this is treasonous, if you will. So if the things didn't turn out how they historically turned out, these guys would have probably been hung, right? They would have probably been tried for treason and convicted. So this is probably, So these guys are making a kind of a big kind of calculated move here, all right? Now, what the idea, and they were talking about how the Declaration of Independence is not just a document that states we want to be independent from Great Britain, but it also is this idea holds up in this philosophy that consent, approval, whatever, to be of government comes not from above, not from the top down, from the bottom up. It comes from the people is the idea, right? And this is a kind of the concept of human rights. Right, the idea of, and remember that it's mentioned in there, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Now, Jefferson actually kind of stole some of that from a philosopher in the Enlightenment named John Locke. Right, like I said, doesn't kind of credit. So some of the stuff he's kind of being inspired by, if you will. But this isn't, again, this is history. A lot of times, and since the summer here, there's been a lot of things that have been analyzed. About kind of American history, all right? And sometimes our inability to kind of deal with events in the past, all right? Like the video said, there was initially something in there, which Jefferson had written about slavery, right? Which is ironic. And again, it doesn't seem to kind of fit like kind of like what we would classify as kind of like common sense to a certain degree, because he himself owned slaves, all right? So Jefferson had a really kind of strange relationship with that concept here. But the idea here is that this is highly kind of focused on the fact that government needs to kind of address the needs of the people, and the people are the ones who give government the right to govern, if you will. All right. So what we start to see here is that after the American Revolution, all right, and as I said, that this is like historical cliff notes. After the Battle of Yorktown, essentially, is considered the kind of the final battle of the American Revolution. But like in March, we get Kazimierz Pulaski Day off. You guys know who that dude is? Not French, he's Polish. All right. That was never in Illinois. He actually helped train the cavalry during the American Revolution. We depended on a lot of help from France, which ironically, France was kind of an absolute monarchy at this time. All right. So, but he died, Pulaski died at the Battle of Savannah in Georgia. There's a statue down there of him. We get that day off in March, though, because Chicago has a large Polish population. All right. So, fast forward to this. After the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, we put in place with the Continental Congress the first kind of form of government, which we refer to as the Articles of Confederation. All right. And a confederation is just a loose association of states. So it's the 13 colonies, but the problem is that we are kind of going from a government that had a strong centralized government with a strong king and Parliament and that, and we are essentially basically doing almost the exact opposite. All right, we don't want that strong centralized government, and to a certain extent, the 13 colonies kind of act as their own little independent sovereign nations almost. All right, so what ends up happening here is under the Articles of Confederation, there was only one branch of government, all right, and that was the legislative branch. So we see the establishment of Congress. Now we don't get into yet where we have the House of Representatives and the Senate just yet. That comes a little bit later, all right. But like I said, what ends up happening here is each state kind of acts as its own independent kind of like entity, all right? And so kind of they have their own sovereignty, absolute power, which is great if you're a Virginian, or which is great if you're kind of like, you know, like a New Yorker or whatever like that. But it's not necessarily great if you want to create a kind of united country, if you will, right? So this creates a little bit of problems. There's some issues here with this structure that have to be addressed a little bit later. All right, you guys got this? Am I moving kind of quick? I'm trying to kind of knock this out here. All right, so I think this is the last one, right? This is the last thing in notes here for the section. All right, so the weaknesses of this, like I said, one, there was no executive branch. Like I said, we did the exact opposite. We didn't want to have a centralized leader. We just got rid of a king, right? So we don't want to go back to that idea initially. So we don't have a president. We don't have like kind of like, you know, somebody to kind of unify the country, if you will, under a nation concept. There's no judicial branch as of yet. Each kind of state would have their own kind of courts, right? And it got kind of confusing, like what laws, like once you cross state lines, you know, what laws pertain to what individuals. No common currency. Each states were probably able to print their own money. That created problems. How much is a Pennsylvania dollar compared to a Virginian dollar? Right? Taxation was left up to the states. If the states wanted, like, basically, it's almost like if you want to give money to the federal government, yeah, you can give it. That's fine. But generally, if someone says like, hey, you know, if you want to give some money, that's cool. You're generally not going to do that, right? You know, so the money tended to stay within the states there. And then 9 out of the 13 states for a consensus, meaning basically they had to come to an agreement here for any kind of laws to be passed on kind of like what we call federal level. That was nearly impossible to get 9 states, because these states, 9 out of 13, they're different in the sense. Massachusetts, like kind of like goals and needs are different than those of Georgia, right? These were kind of different geographical areas that didn't all see eye to eye. All right. So as a result of this, the next time we'll talk about nodes, we'll talk about some events that are going to lead these guys who were the framers of the Articles of Confederation to scrap the whole idea. And that's where we'll get our Constitution. All right. So hopefully you guys at home, this wasn't too confusing. I'm going to stop the recording. Peace.